Good morning, everybody. I heard that music and I thought I might do a little dance a la Theresa May, but I thought that didn't go well, did it? So I'll move on. So I'm here to talk about the state of the nation, and as you can imagine, that's pretty difficult. If you go by the consensus in the press and media, we're all doomed, but I'm hoping to give you a more balanced insight into what's happening across the world, and in particular in retail. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the economy very quickly, and then I'll move on to retail, the outlook and opportunities in retail. And so going on to the economy, and as I said, I go over this pretty quickly because I've only got 10 minutes to talk to you, so I will be talking quite quickly. This is the economic forecast from 2006 to 2024 for GDP, year-on-year growth. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this because it's so impossible to forecast what's going to happen. This forecast here is based on there being some kind of deal with the European Union, sorry. But we really don't know what's going to happen. We've done okay so far. We didn't go into a technical recession this year, but you can see in 2008-9 that global financial crisis really put us into recession. And there is a global economic downturn, so it looks likely that growth is going to be pretty slow whatever happens in the future. But looking at other factors that have an influence on what we spend, this is, although it says employment, this is actually looking at the percentage of the workforce that are unemployed in the UK. And as you can see, it's gone down in 2012 from 8% down to 3.9% now, and it's going to roughly average about 4% going forwards because we haven't got a lot of people coming in taking up jobs. It's going to be a problem in the future. So this is good news because it's actually meant that there are 3 million more people working in the UK now, 2 million of them full-time and 1 million part-time. So we've got 32 million people actually working, and they've got money to spend, in theory. And another factor that benefits spending is the fact that consumer price inflation, which is the pink line here, the lower line, has been fairly steady, whereas wages, average weekly earnings, have been going up. So that gap between wages and inflation is widening, which means that we should have bigger disposable income. So again, that gives us more reason to spend. But then if we move on to consumer confidence, and this is our monthly consumer confidence tracker, which we've been doing for the last 5 years. And you can see on the left that's on a monthly basis, and on the right is an annual basis. And that minus 38% is the lowest it's been in the last 5 years. And the thing is, we're asking consumers what is their future outlook for the economy, for their jobs, for their spending, and they all say it's pretty bad. But as I said at the beginning, there's this noise all around us that will put us off spending. So they're not spending on big ticket items, they're prioritising spending, and they're not moving house. And so that has a big impact on any kind of home-related retail. So until consumer confidence improves, it's really going to be tough over the next few years. But the thing is, they still carry on spending until it really starts to affect them, and that's what leads to a recession. At the moment, if they're still in jobs and their friends and family are still in jobs, then they think it's going to get worse, but they just carry on spending. So now looking at retail, this is our forecast for retail, UK retail, spending and growth to 2024. And looking at that tends to look quite positive because we've got around 2.3% growth forecast per year. But what you have to take into account there, a lot of that is going to be inflation. There's going to be inflation in food, and there's going to be inflation in the supply chain, which is ending up going to be passed on to the consumer. So, and we spend about 40% of our income on food, on retail spending on food. So that means that actually underlying growth is still going to be pretty poor. And one of, everybody talks about, it's online retail, that's what's impacting growth. But there are other factors that are affecting growth. And if we look at retail over the last 40 years, In 1978, we spent 48 billion in retail. That's the year we spent. In 2018, we spent 335 billion. Now, the population has grown over that time, but actually spending per head has grown. And as a baby boomer, obviously, we've been real drivers of consumption over that period. But what we're seeing, if we look at spend over that period, are the green lines are actually increase in spending by value. But that pink line shows growth, annual growth in retail. And as you can see in the trend line, it's going down. So demand has been falling over that period. And everybody talks about we've got too much stuff, but you can see here that actually spend is falling. I know this all sounds terribly depressing, but it is actually. And what that means, in effect, is that the average annual increase in spending, what's out there for everybody to grab, the average increase between 1978 and 1988 was 6.8 billion. So retailers all had 6.8 billion to go for. But then over the last 10 years, it was only 5.2 billion. And there are far more retailers out there, and retailers have got far more space. They've got far more mouths to feed. So they're all fighting over less money to spend. So what they're actually depending on is those casualties, the ones, the weaker operators, the ones that are highly indebted, that are falling out of the market. For instance, last year, you had Madeleine, Toys R Us, and Poundland all went. That actually released over £1 billion of spending for other retailers to pick up. So what's happening is this is a retail evolution. The weaker operators are falling out, and those that are left are picking over the remains of spending, and that's what's driving the market. It's not actual overall growth. And again, looking at online, we are a very mature online retail sector. And you can see here the growth of online, which is the green line above, and offline, which is the red line, and they're beginning to converge. And it was really interesting last week when John Lewis reported, because the department store, which has got one of the most mature online businesses, said that its online growth was flat, and its online penetration is over 40%. So you can see that that multi-channel model that is being accepted by consumers is actually bringing growth together. So looking here, this next slide, you can see here the penetration by sector in retail, and this is the forecast for 2024. And you'll see that total non-food, we're forecasting 28%, but you can see it varies very much across all the different sectors. In entertainment, 90%, and that's because of streaming. You don't really need a product there. But if you look at books, which is one of the most mature online sectors, you can see we're forecasting 60% penetration. But that's actually reaching some kind of equilibrium now. You're not finding it's growing more. And this could be a model for what's going to happen to all the other sectors as well, although food has got a long way to go to reach that. But I've noticed on the tube, for instance, I see more people reading books. It seems that that's the kind of level that we'll get to. So you need that mix of retail space as well as online. But this is a bit more depressing. This is showing growth in category spend over the next 5 years. And you can see most of the growth, as I was saying, there's going to be a lot of inflation, is in food and grocery, whereas the other sectors are going to see very little growth, and they're going to be fighting very hard for all of that. But stores do have a true value, and this is research we've done over the last 2 or 3 years, looking at the value of stores. And if you look at this is split by store sales, 72%, click and collect sales, online sales browsed in store, online sales not browsed in store, and online pure plays. And if you look at that, 80% of sales are store dependent because those click and collect sales are dependent on a store, and those online sales browsed in store are dependent on a store as well. And you could also say the online sales not browsed in store might have some, the store has probably got some kind of halo effect as well. So we're seeing that there is still a very strong need for stores. And that is reflected by the two biggest online retailers in the world getting into stores. You've got Alibaba with Huma. It's a Chinese supermarket that it's developed, and it is developing across. It's starting from scratch, which is something I think you have to bear in mind as well. And you can say with Amazon, although it bought Whole Food, it's Amazon Go. It's starting from scratch. So it's almost we don't want to have anything to do with legacy retailers. We want to start from scratch. And the primary reason for their success as well is their focus on the consumer. And this is really what's driving everything that's happened. Before, you could just open a store and we'd all go there. But now, the consumer is a demand, and we're all chasing demand. And consumers are changing all the time. So you've got changing lifestyles. They're always connected. We're always on. We're saturated with information. And we're also saturated with choice and product. There's fragmentation across the whole of society, but in employment, we've got the gig economy. We don't just have one career, we have lots of careers. You've got side hustles, lifestyles are changing, our spending is changing as well, what we spend our money on. And there's an impermanence about life now. We're renting more, renting houses more, but not owning products. So we lease cars or we use Uber. We're not so much caring about owning product. And there's more individualism. There's more single households. There's more focus on self, as you see in social media. And we're focusing very much on health and wellness. But there's also more focus on values, on ethics, sustainability, diversity, inclusion. All those things are very topical, and it's the forefront of consumer minds. Whether they actually do anything about it, a lot of it is dependent on budget. And that's another thing about retail, is it's all about value, convenience against experience. And over the last 10 years, we've spent 150 billion more as consumers on things like leisure, culture, sport, travel, against 50 billion more on retail. So there's this big shift in how we spend our money. And forecasting as well, you can see this consumer spending, 27%, this is over the next 10 years, increase in total consumer spending. And of that, non-food retail would be 18%, whereas you look at leisure and it's going to have 32% growth. So it's the way that we're spending our money that is changing. So the future of retail is no longer just about retail. It's about a lot of other things that retailers have to get involved in, and also shopping centres and property owners as well. So it's about services and entertainment. It's about brand building online and offline, but you don't need as many stores for that. But you're also seeing that manufacturers are going direct to the consumer. Then you've got value, and value isn't just about Aldi and Lidl in the food sector. It's also about B&M, general merchandisers, and TK Maxx is doing well as Primark. There's this great need for value, but it's got to look like value. But you've still got to be careful. You're not going to saturate the market. Where are you going to take it when you've got so far? There's also experience in advice. IKEA actually went to the planning studio for a kitchen the other day. And you've got Apple with its town stores are supposed to be, giving you lots of advice as places to meet. And also brands, though. There's still a real strong need for brands, because with all this choice out there, you've got to have a reason to connect with a retailer, and it's more about being a brand. And that's why you're seeing such strong growth from the sports brands, for instance, that really you emotionally tie in, and it also ties in with the health and wellness. So, having said all that, I think that what the reality is we're going to have very little growth over the next, the next decades in Western economies. We're very mature. All the growth is coming from developing economies, and that's where the future is going to be. And I know I'm leaving on quite a depressing note, but it's actually quite a positive note as well, because we've got an awful lot to offer. But we all have to look east, as well as think about how are we going to make a new, inspiring retail sector in existing economies. And it's much more challenging, but I think the UK is usually way ahead of lots of other countries. So it's a very positive place to be. And on that, I'll conclude by retail. This is a retail evolution we're going through. It's not a retail apocalypse. You've got to stay ahead of demand, which is the consumer, and the consumer's changing all the time. And you also have to have relevance and focus. You must be relevant to what consumers want, what lifestyles they have, and also to be focused. You can't be everything to everybody. You've got to be focused. And on that note, I think I've gone over 10 minutes, but thank you, and we'll hand back to Miya.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you. Would you like to come and join me on the sofa? And I'd like to ask my other two panellists to come and join us as well. We have Madeleine and Mark. Now, I think we have some time for some Q&A. Maureen, thank you very much for that hugely insightful presentation. I had the honour of introducing you, although I'm sure I didn't do you justice, but I'd like to go to our other two panellists and get them to introduce themselves and tell us a bit about what their view on what we're about to discuss would be.
Sure. So I'm Madeleine McDougall. I head up the commercial real estate and housing team at Lloyds Bank. That looks after anyone investing in commercial real estate across all sectors, but also house builders and social housing providers, and also hotels. So quite a broad brush, but just in the UK.
Very broad. Thank you. And Mark?
Morning, I'm Mark Robinson. I'm president of Revo this year, which is quite an exciting time to be at the heart of the industry. And I also founded a business called Ellandi, which is one of the UK's bigger investors in regional retail and repurposing.
Thank you, Mark. So I think if I can come to you, Maureen, first, maybe you'd like to add anything that I didn't do justice for in the introduction, but follow on by saying when you came to do the presentation, what did you think would be the key takeaway for our audience today? What do you think they should
I think that the key takeaway is that there's going to be little retail growth, and you've got to live with that kind of world. And I think that there's a rapid change as well. So the legacy retailers are... we've seen all the CVAs and everything, but this is shaking out a model that no longer works. And you're going to get new brands that come along, but they probably won't last very long. You've seen like Jack Wills, for instance, or even French Connection. You have this peak, and then how can you keep it going? You've got to really keep reinventing yourselves. So I think from a property point of view, you've got to be very, very flexible about your tenancy. You've got to be very astute about what's happening in the world and really keep ahead. You can't lease properties for 25 years now, because that retail is probably not going to last for 5 years. But so.
I think that's the point to note here. It's about agility, isn't it? I think things are changing at such a pace now, and that's not just in retail. That's, you look at politics, you look at the macroeconomic environment, you look at what banking has been through, and the retailers that survive are those who can adapt. And it's not as though retail hasn't adapted before. It used to be mail order, then we've gone to big shopping malls, now it's online. And there's a saying out there that in the midst of difficulty, there's opportunity. So it'll be those retailers who can really grapple with that changing nature of the consumer, of currency shifts, of living wages, and their brands that are going to survive. What I do think is interesting is, Maureen, you say we've got to look east, but that is...
Well, I think in the long term.
That might be really interesting. But in the UK, what I find which we're going to play out is when you talk to the retailers, they're actually quite a positive and optimistic bunch, the ones that are innovating. But we obviously, as a bank, back quite a lot of these retailers, and we went out and spoke to them. And the thing that I thought was quite interesting was 70% of retailers thought there was going to be a downturn in the economy in the next year, but 70% of retailers thought their profits were going to grow in 5 years. So they're an optimistic bunch anyway. So, it's going to be about getting through that period and seeing which are going to be the winners and losers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think they were telling you that because you're the bank?
You'd hope that we would have a clearer view of the economy than them, maybe, I don't know.
It's so true. Mark, I mean, your thoughts on this? Do you discern any trends specifically for retail property from the discussion and the data you've heard so far?
I mean, Maureen spoke very well to many of them. There's a few things she missed. The sort of a lot of self-inflicted idiocy, which is not making our industry any better. Business rates being an obvious one. The current lack of anything credible in terms of political leadership. It was a bit of a shame we didn't have things can only get better as the intro music, because it would have reminded us of a time when we had a credible opposition, for example. So there is so much going on that I think it has caused a realization in the industry that this change is not cyclical. Things are not going to get back to where they were. Things shouldn't go back to where they were. I don't think anybody wants things to go back to where they were. This time it is different. And that has got some profound changes we're only just starting to grapple with. I do think it means that events like this, organisations such as Revo, become more and more important, because unless we can come together and debate this and be honest with each other about the change that's required, we're not going to make those changes. But at the end of the day, we had a way of doing business in a post-war period, which was, as a property industry, build shiny things and they will come, lease them for 25 years and they'll be happy, and you just collect the rent. We talked about flexibility and the rise and fall of retailers. That's just something we've got to embrace, because actually that's what consumers want as well. They want that change, but unfortunately we have our system set up in such a way that creates so much friction between the owners of real estate and the occupiers of real estate. We've got to think very profoundly about how we get rid of that friction to allow those people, those growing brands, those innovators that are out there to be into our space, to make to activate our space and make it that engaging place that society needs.
Yeah.
That's before we even start talking about alternative uses as well.
Yeah. And it's about that experience, like you say. What's interesting is when we went out and surveyed the retailers that we back, 50% of them realised they had to change the in-store experience. And that, I'll pick out someone, but, if you go to a Marks and Spencer's now, they haven't changed the store layout or the way you shop for, I don't know, since I started going as a child, right? So people realise that the consumer wants to go, and whether it's a sports store that now puts on yoga classes, or whether it's retailers coming together. So, for example, I went somewhere the other day and Next had put a paper chase in there, which you wouldn't think would go well together, but the paper chase was actually really performing but couldn't afford its own store, so they moved in together. And banks are doing exactly the same thing. We now have a non-branded business store that is effectively a combination of a few clearers that you can go and, as a business banking customer of any one of 4 banks, can go and use that store. So it's about that collaboration.
Yeah.
And the experience for the consumer.
Yeah, I often talk about working together to stand apart, and I think retailers and other operators of other sectors are realising that they're going to have to do that. Because I was going to ask you, do you think the high street town centre is dead? It sounds like you wouldn't.
Well, I really hope not. I mean, obviously, it's where our communities thrive. Yeah. The retail industry is incredibly important. It's where 1/3 of our consumer spending goes. The retail industry, I think, employs nearly 3 million people. So, we really want it to continue to thrive. I think what's really interesting is, we talk a lot about where that balance between the online and the store goes. And there's no doubt that online is growing. Obviously, there's that differential between the sectors, but it used to be 20%. It looks like the non-food was there at 28%, so 30%. And you read articles that it might get up to 50% in the next 10 years. Now, obviously, no one knows that, but that's some of the words that have been thrown out there. And obviously, that means that there's going to be more stores that are empty. So it goes back to Mark's point, which is if we know that we've got too much space, where is that too much space and what are we going to do about it? Do you have a engaged local authority who's going to work with you to try and re-engage some of these city centres? And I think the problem we have, and obviously I'm sure Mark will talk to this, which is the areas where you need quite a lot of funding to reinvent those city centres are places where the viability for the alternative use is quite difficult. Is that what you'd say?
Mark, would you like
Well,
to come?
yeah, I mean, yeah, we've got to be careful. You know, we talk this idea that, you know, change is a bad thing in a lot of these places. A lot of our high streets, a lot of our shopping centres are pretty crap. You know, Clone Town is a thing. Our business model was wrong. We created these spaces that people fell out of love with. And as a result of all the sort of factors that Maureen's talked about, they're getting a long overdue kicking. But that is an opportunity to make these places the places where they would have been beforehand, before the value of retail drove out all of those other uses we want to bring back in now. But, you know, Maddie hits the nail on the head. One of the problems we absolutely do have is it's all well and good affecting change if house prices are £600 a foot and office prices are £40 a foot. But that isn't the case in a lot of places. You know, clearly government help is needed. They are MHCLG, who Revo work with a lot, are very capable people who've got a real passion for urban renewal. Again, sort of the way government is now showering money on the left behind towns that might be Labour, Tory marginals. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. Might not be the most structured way of doing it at the moment, but it's going to instill change. But we still need more than that. You know, 3.6 billion in the context of the wider urban regeneration we need is a drop in a bucket. You know, we need Maddie and her company to feel very comfortable about investing in town centres. We need the amazing amounts of global capital that's looking for, you know, returns on infrastructure. And what's infrastructure? It's not town centres. It's the heart of everything. But at the moment, we haven't created an environment where people can invest comfortably at the moment. And that's what's needed to start this nationwide regeneration.
I think there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about town centres, about them making them more community and social and having residential there. Because if you have people living there, then they'll want facilities. But you don't really see it happening very quickly. I think things like hospitals are... you've got shopping centres in the middle of nowhere, and you've got hospitals in the middle of nowhere. Why aren't they next to each other? Then you could share your parking space, you know.
Schools.
And W.H. Smith would not getting so much money from hospital shops because they've got a captive audience.
Absolutely. I think we as an industry have a lovely habit of putting words that shouldn't go together. We talk about glocal nowadays, don't we, where we've got the effect of globalisation, but we seem to be looking more locally. I mean, Maureen, if I can bring you in on this from a perspective of your research, what are the signs to look for in terms of for potential collaboration? So picking up on what Madeleine said about collaborating, picking the right partners, making more use of the space, mixed use. Are you seeing any good partnerships, collaborations?
Well, it's quite opportune, actually, because I met this guy about 6 weeks ago or something from a company called Movement Strategies. And he was telling me what the work they're doing with Bath Bid. And what they're doing is they're collecting a huge amount of data, and they're doing it with Visa and O2. So they're seeing how consumers are acting with their mobile, so they know where they live. It's all anonymized, but it's, you know, where they're coming from, where they're going into the town, where they're spending their money. And then with Visa as well, they know what they're spending their money on and where they're spending it. And then they're looking at social media and seeing what their reaction is to different experiences in Bath. And then they're looking at footfall as well. So they're combining all those things together and using that with Bath for Bath to develop its town centre. And I thought that was a really interesting way of using big data.
Yeah,
really.
absolutely. I think the thing I take away from that is data is becoming more and more and more important, isn't it? I mean, Madeleine, you've quoted a couple of statistics from surveys, and I was going to ask you, given the fact that we're kind of starting to round up on our thoughts now, where you think the opportunities are, and maybe have you any advice for anybody about the use of data in identifying those opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, data is going to be absolutely key. To Mark's point earlier, if you want to get people to invest, whether it's equity or debt, the more data you have, the easier that is. And we've been running some pilots with some of our sponsors and borrowers that effectively say, 1 in 4 card transactions goes through a Lloyds, either debit or credit card. And in fact, in Scotland, through our Bank of Scotland brand, that's actually 1 in 2. So we have a huge amount of data. The difficulty is you have so much data, it's choosing the right things to pick out. But actually, the data that we've pulled out goes to the point of, what are your demographics? How far are they traveling? Are they buying pants at M&S but jumpers at H&M? Which retailers work well together? What retailers should stock and when? What their store layout should be. I mean, all of this is, you think it would be sort of second nature, but when you look at the data, actually some of the things that come out of it are quite surprising. And I've used this stat before, but I do think it's one of my favorites, is when we did our first initial pilot, we found out that if you had a Wetherspoons pub in your shopping centre, that your spend at Ann Summers went up significantly. Which is my favourite stat.
On a Friday afternoon.
Go to Wetherspoons first. So, that sort of data is absolutely key. I think the issue that that people underestimate with data is that, the priority is keeping customers' data safe. Banks have done a lot of work on this basis, but when we talk to retailers, 24% of retailers still say that they're not ready for a cyber attack, and cyber attacks are becoming more and more prevalent. So that is something that needs to be worked on before we start using vast amounts of data without the protections there. Yeah. But it is absolutely vital and really important. And then to your question, which is, what are the 2 things that we're really looking to focus on, is the data side, but also sustainability. So interestingly enough, the 2 worst offenders in terms of sustainability, carbon emissions, are retailers and the built environment. So 33% of carbon emissions come from the built environment. Actually, I heard a stat the other day, which I thought was really interesting, is if we just insulated our buildings properly, we'd be able to hit the 2050 carbon zero target. But yeah, we need to do a lot of work on the sustainability front. I mean, you only have to turn on the news and it's Brazilian rainforest burnings, it's the ocean plastic, it's the glaciers melting, it's the sort of issue of our time, and we need to be really on board with that, which is why we've launched our sustainability app. If you haven't seen it, please go on. You can just look and see how your built environment, if you are a landlord or your own property, what you can do to make your real estate greener, more sustainable. And we also have a 1 billion fund to help make buildings go from brown to green, as we call it, and it's discounted margin funding to be able to allow you to do that.
Great, thank you, Madeleine. I'm going to come to you, Mark, and then Maureen will, for closing thoughts, just picking up, trying to pull together so many of the great threads we've had here. I mean, retailers and property owners are historically would think that they're pretty good at picking their location. So have you any comments, Mark, on the data side of things, and also how data is going to fit into this other massive issue around sustainability, much as less profitability?
Crikey, that's a
I know, I've
closing question and a half.
Sorry.
Look, data is clearly critically important, and people say data is the new oil, but oil in itself is this mucky brown stuff you can't do an awful lot with.
But are we sharing?
Well, this is what I was going to go on to. So you've got to refine it, and then you've got to use it, and that requires a collaboration. You can turn the oil into petrol and put it in a car, but you still need a driver. And certainly when it comes to the collaboration between owners and occupiers, we just need a paradigm shift in how we share things. We need to be much more open about the actual parameters of success within the built environment, what the footfall is, what the energy consumption is, what the sustainability matrix is of that shopping centre, to allow an occupier to make an informed decision. But likewise, we need it coming back from the operators as well. We need to know if that store is not working, so that we can either help them or we can let them go early. We really need to, this idea that people are bound in by law, under statute, into this legal relationship which nobody can break free of, other than through court practically, or CVA of course, is broken. And if we can foster that relationship where the data is shared, we'll all understand what good looks like. And then again, I could go back to what I said. At that point, Maddie's going to feel an awful lot more comfortable about lending us money. And, John Duxbury over there at M&G, he'll start thinking about investing in town centres again. But he won't do that until we can prove to him that there's a sustainable business case based on data.
Absolutely. Maureen, coming back to you to wrap up, do you see, your presentation was so insightful. You mentioned ethics and growing awareness among consumers about where their food and their goods come from. So is sustainability a massive issue? And I suppose, can we tie it back into data? Are you seeing retailers and property owners actually worrying about that, or are they worrying about these more shorter term
I think they are
issues?
worrying about it, because there are, there's carbon emissions that we've got to try and conform to, standards that we've got to conform to. So as businesses across the piece, and there's a lot more about corporate social responsibility for businesses as well. They've got to be seen to be doing the right thing. From the point of view of their customers, their stakeholders, their investors, everybody. I think it's very at the forefront, and as you were saying, it's at the forefront for consumers as well, especially plastic.
Are they, can I ask you, because you're more consumer focused, are consumers really
I was just about to say,
focused as they...
I say it's at the forefront of a topic of conversation, but whether you actually do it, it's like consumer confidence. Oh, it's all going to be awful, but I just carry on spending at the moment. Oh, it's all going to be awful. We're going to be buried in plastic, but that'll be all right in that bin. It's you can really only do it when you've got the wealth and the choice. I think.
And it's a lot to do with perception in my mind. If you give a consumer a more sustainable choice, but the offer is the same and the amount of value and ostensibly price is the same, you can bet they'll probably go for the more sustainable option. So I think it's just another way of saying, coming at equal and opposite way of saying what you were saying.
I think it's that the rental and recycling, though, is probably more of a danger to retailers, in that they're being cut out of it. It's going, consumer to consumer rather than business to consumer, and that's an area that's is growing. At the moment, it's not huge, but it's growing.
I think where you see opportunities, where you see challenges on one side, it's like squeezing a balloon, isn't it? The opportunities balloon on the other side. So in that sense, you're seeing online subscriptions growing. So you could actually have a consumer tie into you on an ongoing basis, where you might be losing slightly more one-time seasonal type of sales as well. We have a chance just to wrap up amongst the three of us. Any thoughts that you're going to take away? Anything you really want to?
So I'm definitely. I don't want to underestimate the difficulties that are out there, but I'm definitely a glass half full person. I think if, as an industry, if we face into it, as Mark says, we work together, there's always opportunities out there. And the one thing that I picked up the other day, which is of interest, which is although online sales are going to grow, 20% of retailers said they're going to stop free delivery in the next year. And 44% of retailers say click and collect drives their footfall to their stores. And when people come for click and collect, so I know this is loads of stats, but 70% of them make an impulse buy. So look, there's opportunity out there, and it's just about harnessing it and working together as an industry.
Absolutely. Maureen?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's lots of opportunities out there. There's lots of challenges, but we are a very creative retail sector in the UK. It's very, very competitive, and I think that's what's made us very creative.
Very resilient too. Mark?
Well, I just, on behalf of Revo, I'd like to thank you all for attending. It's a really difficult market. Things are, it's very difficult to justify being out of the office, the expense and everything else. And I'd especially like to thank those people who've attended this year who we wouldn't have had here before. There's been a huge effort by the executive team and through the membership committees to really try and be the organisation we want to be, which is about placemaking based on our retail foundations. So huge efforts being going into curating local authorities to come along. But I met people from student housing last night, which they just wouldn't have been here 2 years ago. And for us to really curate these future places that work for everybody, that can support the suitable amount of retail that's left, we do need. Homes England are here this afternoon. That's hugely important. They're part of this conversation. We've got a bit of a way to travel as an industry. We've got a bit of a way to travel as Revo. But last night gave me so much confidence we're on the right track. it's going to be a very interesting few years ahead.
Absolutely. I think we've hopefully ended on a positive note, and I think we're all in absolutely the right place to achieve that. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, before I let our esteemed panellists go, that's the end of it for this session, but I please like to ask you to stay in your seats. As you'll notice the programme, as I said at the beginning, this is a double slot before we let you get back to your caffeine. So I'd ask you to thank our panellists and let them go while I welcome Ed, our next moderator for the next session, to the stage. So Madeleine, Maureen, Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you.